Okay. You're now live.
Okay. This meeting is being recorded. Continue.
So
Can we have
you need a motion to open, Charles.
Motion.
Indeed. Do we have a motion to open the June Budget Advisory Committee meeting?
I make a motion to open the meeting.
I seconded.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Can we have a motion to approve the draft minutes from our May Budget Advisory Committee meeting?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Great. So I thought we could, recap where we left off, just
Charles,
feedback.
Charles, we need a secretary, and I was going to offer my services.
You were. And I
Go
forgot about
for it, Bill.
Thank you, Bill.
Here's for
I got-
Bill. Hooray, hooray, hooray.
Awesome. Thanks,
I
Bill.
depend on you guys for the critique that will be needed.
Not to worry. Glenn and Ed and depending if which end I'm on, we all help. So we got you covered, Bill.
Okay.
I am officially appearing as the
I'm-
visible man.
I'm sorry I interrupted you, Charles.
Oh, no problem. No, great point, and thanks for volunteering. Our first item on the agenda was to just recap where we stand with respect to the adopted budget. If anybody had any, updates that they wanted to share or additional feedback, and then from there we could talk about how we want to structure the upcoming year with a schedule and priorities and next steps and all that great stuff. So did anyone want to talk about the adopted budget as it stands, anything that we haven't, covered to date, and et cetera?
Well, there was a budget adopted, which included supposedly a capital budget, which I understand is not part of the adopted budget, and therefore the trustees are going to meet on or about the 14th, I believe, Dan,
That is correct.
to formally set priorities and establish a capital budget that presumably is affordable and that reflects the trustee priorities. And it appears from the document that, there's a lot of ranking and scoring and so on in that document. And so I'm not sure if that's what input, if any, we can provide, Dan, that would be helpful, but that seems to be still very much up in the air. And projects are being approved and so on. So
If I could comment, the actual decisions of what gets priority is obviously the purview of the board. But one of the things that I think would be helpful. Glenn, are you on or not?
Yes, I am here.
Okay. You're being unusually quiet, so we were very concerned.
We
So
see
the-
your fan, Glenn, but
I think it's the
I
fan.
don't see you.
Yeah, I think I announced I was playing the part of the invisible budget committee member today.
Okay, it's not a problem. So one of the things that I think you can do is help put things in perspective as to how much debt we have, how much gets paid off, how much can be replaced, and for every so many million, what next year's budget before you actually have a budget. I think that type of focus coming from the budget committee will be helpful because of the things I have read over the last couple of days. Everything is being pushed. And, depending on what numbers you want to look at, you're somewhere between $90 million and $200 million in projects. Now, some of that will have funding that is now going to be there. They have decided to take health and safety and put it at 15, which is the highest ranking, equal to that of what is under, court order, that has to be undertaken. I've asked for that to be re-ranked between that which is critical and that which could be postponed, for 1, 2, or 3 years. So that John just joined us. Hi, John. So those are the types of things that I think, in terms of process, would be helpful coming from the committee, should you so desire. I am not sure that on the 14th we are actually going to get to it. I think we will receive it from Jerry by then and probably try and set up a work session. At least I'm going to hope that we could set up a work session specifically to talk about that. A separate meeting. The work sessions have stuff on it that are over 6 months old that have still not been heard, including capital budget priority recommendations that are not being used but have never been adopted.
But I was glad to see that Jerry pulled a lot of information and guidance from the New York State Controller's Office.
Yeah.
I thought that was very good.
Yeah, I'm not sure if everybody actually got a chance, but they did finally get the final budget up, and the attachment with the update on the capital. If you look through it, it's very informative. They also have the information on the bonds that Dan was talking about, and as per some emails that I had back and forth with Jerry and the trustees and Kelly. Jerry's request was he was waiting for at least 2 more trustees to give what their priorities were for the upcoming year. I believe Dan did his, and it was being incorporated into the document. I believe Kelly did hers, and he was waiting on a couple of others. And the other suggestion was go back to the department heads and ask them what is broken, absolutely 100% has to be replaced. There is no longer any time to push it back. So Jerry indicated that he was going to also do that. And I assume at some time present to the trustees, a list from the department heads of, look, these are priority projects that, under no circumstances can we push back anymore. Whether it's the roof of Village Hall or the crane broken down at the harbor or the seawall, they'll come back, or the shed that's gonna go over the transfer station. They'll come back with that list, and then they'll have to incorporate that into the 5-year budget. And then going forward, hopefully, the suggestion was, and Jerry indicated that it seemed to be a good suggestion, is instead of simply, when a project's ready to go, presenting it before the trustees, if there's going to be an emergency repair and a problem, let the trustees have a heads up that, hey, something broke, something went wrong, that's going to have to be addressed this year. And early in the process, come up with an assessment of what the costs are going to look like, and then they'll have to readjust the capital budget again.
I think one of the biggest challenges that Jerry and the trustees are going to face is the change in behavior from the department heads, trying to follow a serious 5-year capital plan. that it's not the way it used to be. And I think that's gonna take time for that to change.
Well, they did. If you look at the capital plan that's in the budget, that was approved, the approved budget,
Just so we are clear, as far as I'm concerned, there is no capital budget in the approved budget. There was nothing there, period. But
So
that's,
technically, last year's budget by default would have carried over.
I understand that, but I don't think that's what's been done. So, but that,
And that's really where I'm saying,
it doesn't really much matter, and I don't want to get stuck in that particular area.
right, that's where I'm saying it's gonna be a behavioral change that it's not gonna be stuff done on the fly any longer.
Correct.
If you actually have watched any of the Town of Amerenik meetings, they actually have their projects pre-approved for bonding before they start the projects. In other words, they know what's going for bonding before the project starts, as opposed to what we've been doing is we approve a project, we do a project, and then once the project is paid for, we send it out to be bonded. And we probably have about $1.8 million worth of those projects right now.
That's interesting because I'm told we can't bond it before it's been approved and, whatever. So what you're saying is they're going out to bid and doing all of that before they get,
They know what they have to bond before they go out to bid. Their bonding is all lined up. We know how much we're going to be bonding, and these are the projects that are going to be done. And then when the projects are done, they actually bond them, but they actually know every project that is going to be bonded before, they start. And if they add something, they know how it's going to affect the budget because they will adjust what they're going to bond for the year.
When you say,
So,
they know, Glenn,
That's the town board and their controller. Their controller knows that right now they're going to do, let's say, $3 billion worth of bonding this year. And if an emergency project comes up, they make the adjustment within their budget of what they can do. That way, they know how much bonding is going to be done, as opposed to the Village of Amerenik, which kind of passes projects, and then at the end of the year, when the time is appropriate, Augie will put all the spending together and say, okay, now we're going out to bond for this amount of money, and the trustees approve it. I'll ask Dan this right now. I would assume that the trustees at this time don't have a running total of how much that they have spent that needs to be bonded right now. Is that true, Dan?
I think that is more than a fair statement.
Different subject. It looks like Ed is on as a participant. Can you promote him, Dan?
Well, just a minute. That means I have to see what is there.
I think he came on and he froze.
Here we go.
And we lost
Was
Len.
I'm here. Is John Campbell froze?
John Campbell's here.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it looked like you froze for a second. Okay.
All right, so now we have Ed and we lost Len.
No, I'm here.
well,
I'm here.
well,
Not
He-
Glenn,
Oh, you lost
Len.
Len. Sorry, Len. Yes.
Hi.
hello, Ed.
Okay, Len just sent an email. He's in Maine. Wait, hang on. It says, I'm in Maine and we just lost our internet connection. Please let others know.
See, that's what happens. Go to a different country.
We get one, we lose one.
Yep. But it balances. It's okay.
I don't know. I don't think I balance with Len.
So, any other
I think that point is valid, and maybe it should be made to the board that we should have running totals.
Yep.
I think we should also have a running total on the operating budget of what changes are being made and how it affects it each time on a cumulative basis.
Well, as long as they keep doing the revenue and expense reports every 2 weeks and the summary that they've been doing once a month, you can you can pretty much follow where the spending is there.
No,
The
you
expenses
follow the individuals, but what I'm trying to suggest is, once the budget was adopted, we then
Yeah.
took away $20,000 of revenue, which then would have put us, over the, and then we allocated monies that, for purchase of the, capital equipment that goes into the, the capital fund. And so we don't have a running total of anything. We know what we did, but we don't we don't have a running total of how everything is affected.
Yep.
And that should be done. And the expense, and you can pull it out by trying to put it together if you keep your own running totals. But I don't think that's the way it should be done.
Dan, I'm not quite sure. Are you referring now to the operating budget?
I'm referring to both.
I mean, well, on the operating, don't we get monthly reports of the amounts that have been
You
appropriated?
have monthly reports of what's happened, but you don't have a cumulative of how much you've taken out of the reserves and how much over the cap you would have been had the cap been created. Budget, we had $107 clearance, and we've already changed that, so we'd be way over. And I think that needs to be known so people understand the impact. We're just hoping that things will get better and we don't have to worry about it. And I don't think that is necessarily the most prudent way of looking at things.
Can you expand on, we've already changed that $107 clearance?
Say,
What's changed?
we had $107 clearance to where we would lower the cap.
Right,
And right after that we adjusted the revenue anticipated from the restaurants by somewhere between 10,000 or more, which would have put us way over the cap. We then, so we keep doing these things, which is fine. I'm not suggesting that they are not the right things to do, but there is no running total of what the effect is, so we have in saying, oh, we've spent this much here. Maybe we need to think about this, or it's fine. But just simply saying that we don't need to worry about it because the cap, it's already, the tax bills have already been done, so you don't have to worry about it. And all that does is affect what next year's budget is automatically.
yep,
And I think that type of information is helpful to have, as we keep going through things, on each item, so that we know what the cumulative impact is, if you will. If that makes any sense.
no, it does to me. And things change all the time, so. it may-
Absolutely, and they will.
Yep, and so it may not
How
show
well you
up. on
plan,
the monthly
you're going to
report.
have changes, and it's not to say that the changes aren't warranted. That's not the issue. The issue is what's the effect of the changes, and are we keeping a running totals? So we, at some point in time, if we have to say, well, maybe we need to delay this, we have that in front of us.
Well, that's also though why we recommended forecasts being done for the operating plan, or,
So if you all feel that that's important to have in front of us, the BOT, I think you may want to think about re-emphasizing that to them so that we take note of it.
Yep.
one of the things that we've talked a lot about is the formatting of the reporting, which, you know, being able to analyze year to date on a monthly basis, I think is a good exercise for us to get in the habit of, to carve out that time, and if not through a subcommittee, to be able on a monthly basis to take a look at our year-to-date actuals versus the budget, to have a capability to trend it forward, which will vary depending on the timing. You know, it's not going to be linear necessarily by month, and understanding those timings, but to be able to do that analysis. And I think an important starting point that we've talked a lot about would be to look at the structure of the report that gets distributed, which appears to be very auto-generated, but to be able to condense that into a summary form that we could use as a tool to take consolidated snapshots of where we are. It's I think hard to navigate the, you know, extended report with so many line items, and maybe working with Augie to talk about how that report, whether it be, you know, exporting it to Excel and working with some sort of subtotals or the like, could be an important starting point to use that as a tool throughout the year.
We did have something given by Augie, which was very helpful, is they actually had an attachment that showed a schedule of when anticipated revenues actually occur, whether they are daily like the parking, or they are every 3 months like the sales tax, and when it was anticipated that those revenues would come due. The same thing should be done on the expense side, so that you know that, let's say December is when we get the final bills for the retirement programs. And that's when whatever, you know, adjustment has to be made to what the estimate New York State gave us comes in. I believe in June, we get the majority of what the workman's comp bill is going to be for the year. And, you know, we can have our own, you know, as a budget committee, we should have our own institutional memories about when these are due, how they come in. And once you start to look at the monthly reports, you can start to see trends over the years. Does the parking go up during the spring? Does the parking go down? And then you can start making analysis of when revenues come in, and if revenues are running short, or if revenues are running over, which categories they're running short or over in. And you can start to do the same thing with expenses.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that that's a valuable function we can play, and you know, maybe not during this meeting, but as we, you know, establish next steps with subcommittees, and maybe breaking it down across revenue and expenses, where we could have, you know, different members of the committee focusing on different components, working together to be able to understand how to best analyze the reports. Kind of, you know, a lot of the points that you just made, Glenn, to get that set up and get adept at being able to do that efficiently every month would probably be very valuable.
By the way, Charles, are you picking up a few extra dollars Ubering right now? It says you kind of got that 1 out of 12 look.
I'll tell you, this is making me want to quit my day job. So.
If you all feel that those types of things would be helpful, I think it would be wise for you to consider how to present that to the board.
Well,
It shouldn't be in the minutes. It should be in a communication.
right, but before we do that, I'll happily reach out to Augie and see what kind of canned reports are available in the system that wouldn't cause him to do extra work. Because I
I-
think that's
I-
where we might get pushback.
Yeah.
So we don't know if there are summary reports. So I'll reach out to him tomorrow or next week and see what's
I-
available.
I did think, Alan, that Glenn mentioned it, but I think it wasn't just revenues, it was also expenses that he sent us. That was a forecast for the year because he came up with this $500,000 surplus. And
Yeah.
so he did run, at my recollection, I may be wrong, and a report with both revenues and expenses by month, or the months remaining in the fiscal year. But
Well, let
but
find out.
as Charles said, it was kind of not well formatted.
Yeah, so I'll find out what's available. And then I'll come back to everybody with that.
Yeah, and I will look through some of the reports that they sent, and I will look to find the attachment that had all the different revenue dates in and such, and I can go through because I basically follow all the budget meetings, and I look, both the operating capital, and that tells you a lot of times when certain bills come due because they have to be approved by the trustees. That's how I know that come December, January, that's when we get that's when New York State notifies Augie exactly how much the health retirement for the employees and the health retirement the retirement for the employees and the retirement for the police employees, we get the exact number. The majority of unemployment, I think, is the first of the month. The health insurance is a monthly charge. We get hit with 12 large bills, and then we get hit with usually it's once every 2 meetings we get hit with our Medicare rebates to our employees, and that would add up to $6,000, $10,000, and literally the abstract of the spending would of expenses would show you a list of 70 employees that are being reimbursed. So those you can start to do how we pay the MTA tax. I'm not sure if we pay it quarterly or twice a year. How we pay the payroll tax and what the leg is on that, I'm not sure. That's a question we can ask. And most of the other, the employees get paid, on their regular basis, and that's our biggest expense. And then, whatever expenditures are made, usually the law and things like that. Usually, there's a 1 to 2 month lag when you're paying the lawyers' fees and trees or whatever else. Those tend to come in as they come in, and there's a 1 to 2 month lag. So our fiscal year ends May 31st. They will reconcile bills usually until the first week in July, and that's when we have the end of our the end of our spending, and then we have at the least we have sales tax revenue that still has to come in that we find out we probably receive it in August. But again, you can now figure that out because New York State will tell you how much sales tax revenue Westchester received and whether it's up a certain percent or down a certain percent. So the only thing we need to do at one point is say, can you give us an abstract of how much we got in sales tax and break it down per month? And if you got, let's say $100,000 in sales tax in May last year, and this year they collected 6% more in sales tax, well, then you know you're going to have 106,000 in sales tax this year for May. You don't actually have to wait for the quarter to be over.
Digressing slightly, back to the, maybe a focus for the year and a priority would be with respect to the capital budget, the idea of needing to look at a project over the, its lifespan and to structure the capital budget accordingly and spread that can be probably a daunting exercise to go through across multiple projects. But given the dynamicism of where the capital budget stands, this might be a good opportunity to look at some of the larger, more complex projects like the Army Corps of Engineers project, and to make ourselves available as a resource to, help with the 5-year longer term planning for something like that. So that might be something to propose that we could assist with, and then try to better understand what the process would involve as to how we would engage and what components of that analysis we could be involved with.
Yeah, I think the Army Corps of Engineers is right now kind of in limbo because it needs to be reintroduced and passed through Congress. So right now that, maybe something happens in the fall session, but I'm not even sure if it's in front of anybody right now down in Washington, D.C. The biggest project that we have right now is the new Village Hall, which they're looking to do all these roofs that, for, $800,000, and they had in the capital budget $125,000 study for what they're looking to do with the new Village Hall. And then they also have windows to be replaced in the Village Hall. And I think that all needs to be incorporated into one plan. And, whether you can bond it for 20 years or 30 years, you could probably bond it for a longer period of time because of the type of project it is. But that's something that, maybe, we could say, hey, let's take all these little projects you're doing on the Village Hall, which, actually add up to millions of dollars, and can you temporarily fix the roofs and then incorporate what you're looking to spend to do all the roof repairs into the fact that you're looking to completely redesign and add additions onto the Village Hall and incorporate it as one large project.
Glenn, are you suggesting that that the bonds bear a direct relationship to a particular project? In other words, that that there would be a separate bond for work on the city hall that may have 20 or 30 years because of the particular project, as opposed to a more general.
Well, it's breaking down expense. If you know that you're going to be spending over 5 years, 12, they're expecting like $2.5 million a year. Well, each year you would be bonding, a piece of that project. And if you're doing it over 30 years, that's only a portion of what you're going to bond that year. What you need to do is to say, Village Hall, if we're going to do a Village Hall project over 5 years, the anticipated cost of the bond per year is going to be this, and then you add other bonded projects to any given year. But then you know what the total, you know that Village Hall is going to cost you X amount per year as part of your bonding process. How much are you going to receive back in grants or state aid? And then you go to, your next project. How much is that going to cost? How much is that going to cost you? And then, once you add up the cost of, the different projects, some are multi-year, some are one and outs. And it says, then you have an idea of how much money you're spending in a given year that needs to be bonded. And if you're going to do Village Hall, that you're going to start the year right off with, Village Hall is going to cost you X amount over 5 years because it's a 5-year project to build that. Once they look to do the seawall might take a couple of years to do. So you'd be bonding it, you're not going to bond the entire project right away. You're going to bond the project. You're probably going to bond the project twice, one for the first half of the work that gets done and one for the second half of the work that gets done as it comes in over, the course of a year. And then, the project itself would be the useful life of a seawall, which might even be 40 years. So, if the seawall costs $8 million to replace, you'd need to bond $4 million in year one. If it was a 40-year project, that's $100,000 a year. And then it would be $4 million in year two, and that would be another $100,000 a year in expense, in addition to the $100,000 a year you're paying for the first year that you bonded it. So you have to be aware, if you're going to bond something over multi-years, that, like the library, we're paying, over 20 years. The firehouse, we're still paying for the one firehouse that we built, about 20 years ago. That's, some of the rebonding that was done at a lower rate in 2016, 2017. So, it's tough. It's tough to see that normally what we would do is, like, if we bought a fire engine, you could see that it would be bonded over the course of 20 years. What happened was, because the interest rates got so low in 2016, 2017, 2018, Augie took all of our old debt and consolidated it and got just a terrific rate of interest. Right now, we're paying between like 1.5 to like 2.5% interest on all our debt. So so basically you took debt that was, at 4%, 3-4%, and he ended up saving us hundreds of thousands of dollars because he took all that. So you don't see that. Normally you would pay for the firehouse over 20 years, and you would see that the firehouse bond, was originally in like 2011, and you'd still be paying it. So what you have to be aware of is, if you have a bond that you do for something that's in 1 year, you buy 2 dump trucks, they're $410,000. You get the bill, that bond's going to be for this year. For 20 years, well, you have to, pay, whatever you bond this year, you're going to have to pay in substantial years. If you have a multi-year project, you have to know that you're going to bond each portion of it, and you have to figure out how much of it you're going to bond each year, depending on how much of the project gets done. And that's just the difference between the two. So Village Hall, because it would probably take, might take 3 years to design and rebuild the entire thing, that would be how you would bond it. You would be bonding it as, you know, your expenses came in for each year as you rebuilt it until it was actually done. But that, you know, I don't know if it would take 2 years to rebuild it. I don't know, it would take 4 years to rebuild it. That's something that is a good thing to investigate, what the overall cost would be, and what the life expectancy would be, and how it would affect our bonding over, you know, the course of those number of years that it needs to be rebuilt.
Yeah, but do we know to what extent this is already being done? I mean,
But right now, we actually have about $700,000 worth of projects that are going to be done on the village hall because the roofs are all failing. We
right,
also need window replacement that they have in the budget for $60,000, and that, you know, they have other things that, you know, they've spent tons of money redesigning the interior for the police department. Their locker rooms were horrible at one point. You had leaking pipes. It's just an old building. And once you go in there and start to do a project like this, you have to make it ADA compliant. So I know that the trustees conceptually were looking at putting additions on the village hall and then refurbishing and updating it. And we had scheduled an engineering contract for, I think, $125,000 or $150,000 this year for the design of the project.
okay.
That ties into potential engagement with longer term capital budget planning and our assisting with that in different capacities, and in engaging in the discussion that we just had. You know, Augie seems, you know, quite sophisticated with the process, and our better understanding it would probably be valuable for us to be able to add value back. And getting with him and going through this, and then making that a part of the process for us seems like it would make a lot of sense. You know, both his own understanding of it, but also the schedules that are developed and that are incorporated. And I think there's a lot of information at our fingertips. Glenn, you seem like you have a very good handle on a lot of it. So that's maybe something to consider as part of the prioritization for the year for us, and in the context of subcommittees to make this part of it. We had talked about over the last couple of years wanting to sit with Augie and unpack this with him. So I think that's worthy to add to the list for the upcoming year.
So one of the things I would like to raise, and it's kind of part of this discussion, how involved do we as a committee want to get with specifics on individual projects, like what's going on with the roof right now at Village Hall? So it seems we had that one bid. It seems, I mean, Dan Sarnoff was supposed to get back to me, but he didn't. It seems that we're not going out for multiple bids because that contractor's an approved state vendor, contractor, whatever. I went back to the procurement policy that we all spent a lot of time working on, which I sent out to everybody this afternoon. And it says we don't need to get 3 bids if it's a state contract. So I don't know if a state approved vendor constitutes a state contract, you know, but I would say in a case like this, we need to get 3 bids. It's a huge project.
Well, a state contract, that term is used, because I know I used it at the university.
Yep.
The state has gone out and solicited bids from multiple vendors and engage in, and they have the contracts that are available. However, you'd like to know within our area of the Mamaroneck exactly, was it someone up in, Putnam County or someone who's another bidder, who was higher? I don't know. But typically, state contracts have already been bid out, and therefore they've entered an agreement with the particular vendor on municipal contracts. For example, they would charge the quote preferred rate or the state approved rate.
Right, but that
Ellen?
doesn't, but my question on that, hang on, Bill, I'm sorry. My question on that, though, is do we want to push back on a case like this and say, get 3 bids?
Ellen, there was an email from Jerry that I believe I saw saying that he was dealing with a flood condition, indicating that I don't think it was a matter of.
Yeah, see that.
No, he
that's
said Dan Sarnoff would explain it to me because Jerry was dealing with a flood condition. So
Well-
I'm just saying I haven't heard from Dan, and I'm sure they had to evacuate the building. So
Yeah.
I'm not criticizing Dan. I'm just saying that's still an open-ended question. I was just trying to piece together what was going on there on my own.
I see.
But my question for the committee is on individual cases like this, do we want to recommend to the board that we get 3 bids? Because we may get better bids. Dan, one of the emails from Dan Natchez today pointed out some serious concerns he has with that bid on things being open-ended within it. So we have no idea what that's going to cost us.
Well, here's what they said was, because these were emergency repairs that needed to be done because of the flooding issue, that they could go, instead of the normal 3 bids, they could go under the state contract because it was the repairs needed to be done immediately.
Except Glenn,
There was a time-
hang on. The bid that was sent to all of us a couple of weeks ago was from 2019. So,
Yeah, Ellen, I'm just
no, but
giving you what
how critical is it that we can't wait to get 3 more bids? I mean, come on.
I know, but you're arguing with the messenger. All I'm telling you is what they when they presented it. I'm not saying that I like the explanation. In fact, I would take it a step further. You're supposed to be doing a $125,000 engineering contract, and you're supposed to be starting the new village hall next year. Are the roof repairs that you're doing, can they be incorporated with that construction? Because if you're going to be doing a reconstruction job on the village hall, are these roofs actually compatible with what you're doing? Or are you going to be putting a new roof on, and then you're going to have to be tearing up part of the new roof because of the new designs that are going into the village hall?
Right, but I'm going back to I'm sorry, Len, go ahead.
No. Go ahead. You're finishing up your part of the conversation. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I would like an opinion from this committee. How involved do we want to get in a specific bidding process for a project? Because I personally don't like what's happening with this one. But if I'm the only one on the committee who thinks we should go to the board with my concerns, that's not acting like a committee. That's me acting like an individual citizen. Which
No,
is
I
fine.
have no problem with your questioning about that these aren't emergency projects. Most of them were known for months and months. They only became an emergency project when everything was in place and they were put before the trustees. But the trustees could have easily been informed in most of these cases 6 months to a year ago.
Right, but that's focusing on the emergency part. I'm focusing on the state approved vendor which the procurement policy says if we're going that route, we don't need to get bids. It doesn't mean we can't get bids. So my
Yeah.
recommendation would be we should get 3 bids for this
Ellen,
job.
Ellen,
Ellen, my own view is it could be tying their hands too much. I don't think we should have such a rule. I mean, they have to make a judgment as to whether this is, what they need to do.
Yeah.
And if the procurement policy allows them to do it, I'm not sure we should be second guessing that as.
Well,
budget-
that's why I was asking the question. I
Oh, no,
wanted
that's
everybody-
my, when I worked at the MTA, we did, there are a number of reasons why we would want to go with a state contractor. Some of it was just to get the project done quicker.
Yeah.
Well, I would ask the question. I agree with Ed. Based on my own experience with certain state contracts. But what I would do, Ellen, is ask the question of Dan, why he chose the state to go the state contract route, and what additional information can he add about that? And what assurances does he have that this is appropriate? Using the state contract is appropriate.
Yep.
So you might kind of ask it as a
A roundabout way. Yeah.
without any indication of dissatisfaction, perhaps.
Right. And I don't remember where this contractor was located, but if his firm and his staff,
Yeah.
was hours away, that's a problem.
Yeah, I was going to say that is important.
Yep.
So, but I think on your point, though, Alan, about us getting involved, obviously the biggest project is the rebuilding of Village Hall.
Mhm.
And I know Dan Natchez was asking questions about, I think it was the roof, and are there other options? I think, Dan, is that fair? You had a recent email
Yes.
about that?
Yeah, what is proposed, and again, I don't know who wrote specs and whether we have specs, but it was proposed to take off the entire roof over the courthouse.
Right. The court.
Or the courtroom, and build and put in a new roof with proper flashing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, rather than raising the roof because of the parapets, raising the roof over, and so it just drains off the parapets, and that solves the problem. And it seems to me you could probably put on a false roof for less than what is being proposed, because you're going through a major.
The other thing is, if you actually read a little bit deeper, is that there was a recommendation that since the scaffolding would be up anyway because of the roof repair, that they would also repaint the windows and regrout the brickwork where needed, and then give the building a complete washing. You also have whatever damage was done behind the wall in the courthouse, and I'm sure whatever water damage there also has to be repaired. So that's why the question I have is, with all this money that you're spending on Village Hall, all of a sudden it's over $1 million, and according to your own schedule, you're supposed to start to be rebuilding that building for $12.5 million. And the question is,
It's $20 million at this point.
or $20 million. Well, are these repairs going to, even be incorporated into what you're redoing with the redesign of the building? Is the redesign of the building going to remove one of these roofs that you're putting on now 2 years from now?
Yeah.
Or does the roof have to be redesigned as the building gets redesigned 2 years from now?
Yeah.
So that's why I think that, this has to be incorporated into, we're about to spend $20 million to redo a building. Are we going to spend $1 million this year, and that's the only use we're going to get out of what we're fixing?
Hey, aren't we getting pretty far from the budget committee mission, trying to decide how particular repairs should be made and rebuilding? I mean, it's one thing for us to focus on the controlling of expenses, but to get into the subject of whether it's a good idea to do this in different stages or not, it seems to me is getting a little bit afar.
Bill, that's kind of why I framed my question broadly to begin with.
Yeah,
Do we want to get involved in individual projects?
yeah.
That was my opening remark.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh-huh.
And then I went down a certain path, but I'm with you. I mean, that's really not our purpose. However, I think, amongst all of us, we have a lot of good brain power and some good thoughts. So it doesn't mean we couldn't share our thoughts with the board, but they're not necessarily hardcore recommendations, if that makes sense. I'm differentiating.
Yeah, well, I think.
I think if
I think if I heard $20 million. Now, the first thing I heard Glenn also say, we're going to hire an engineer. That set off a red flag to me right away to design a new building. The first thing is, we don't know exactly how big and who is going to be in that building. We don't have what every project has as a space program. I don't think we have a space program. Okay. Typically, an architect would do that. I'm not sure if we have a survey of existing conditions of the existing building that points out all the flaws, and therefore should lead us to decide whether to rebuild or just repair. To me, there are significant things that are missing before we launch into a $20 million investment. And I agree with Bill. I mean, I'm not going to debate over the windows. I think we have to keep our eyes on the big number, which is the 20 million bucks. And the first question is, do we do a $20 million rebuilding or with a new portion because we're moving from Mamaroneck Avenue 123? And what's the economics of all of that? And what's the actual need? And are we jumping to an option that, that we're not assured is the best way to do things?
Well, the trustees actually, a couple of years ago, and Dan can touch on this further, actually looked in. They were looking into other sites. Do we build a new village hall at a different site? Do we tear down this building and rebuild it, or do we add to the building? And at that time, the consensus of the trustees was that we would add more space to it. Now, what reports were available at that time to the trustees, but I'm sure that they at that time had a report of the condition of the building, and I'm sure that they had a some kind of a space report. But this wasn't something new. It says they believe it or not, they've been discussing this for about 20 years.
Yes,
That's Bill. Yeah,
that I know,
Yeah.
because when my wife was mayor, that was
Yeah.
discussed. So that I know well, and that's the problem which she pointed out.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and like
that
they don't have
there hasn't been that work.
Yeah, they don't have an elevator. They're not ADA compliant. It's tiny. The The police locker rooms are completely antiquated. I think they already got like a trailer out in the back they're doing whatever with. But I mean, that's just, to Ellen's point and to Bill's point, all we can do is we can bring up questions, put them before the trustees, and it's up to the trustees to prioritize what they think the most important, pertinent points are that we present to them. And then they're going to have to make a decision of what they want to do, Do
Right,
they want to
but
do all?
Glenn, I think the point that Bill and I were making, and Bill said it much better than I did, is if we look at our mission statement, it is
Yes.
not to question individual projects.
Yeah.
So that's why I was asking, because this project's huge. And I agree where you're coming from. Are we gonna spend a couple of $1 million? That's complete throwaway money, when we start the bigger project. Having done project management in different space, not real estate, for many years, when you're trying to fix something, there frequently is a chunk of money that you have to spend today to immediately address an issue that down the road, when you, whether it's replace the system or do whatever else, gets thrown in the garbage. That's, kind of a fact of life.
Yeah,
And
you're
it's-
exactly right. You're exactly
it's-
right, Ellen.
The
It's
only
absolutely-
difference here is it's taxpayer dollars, and I'm not trying to
Yeah,
downplay that, but sometimes money has to be spent to fix an immediate need. And the longer term solution makes that fix obsolete. That's fact of life.
Yeah.
Dan,
and-
has a deficiency study been conducted? To your knowledge?
There was a space study that was done and the architects were commissioned to do to look at either doing a new building, doing wings to the existing building. And I've never seen that report, doesn't mean that we didn't get one. But then all of a sudden, we were doing not a new build hall, but a redoing of the existing building with various bump outs.
I wanted to just, if we could circle back, because it relates to what we're talking about, the concept of a 5-year plan, longer term capital planning, and the importance of, understanding the lifespan of the project and how those budgets get allocated across multiple years. That's been talked about for a number of years now as being very important. And it often seems that there are other priorities, where there are accelerated deadlines and pressing deadlines that prevent that exercise from being able to be seen to fruition. So to propose that we engage, I think makes sense. It would have to be a dialogue about how to best utilize us as a resource, but that starts to get into potentially needing to look at these projects individually in a certain degree of depth, understanding, their mechanics, their underlying costs, and being available as a resource to look at them in that capacity. But to kind of circle back to Ellen's point, how do we do that without, overstepping the bounds of our purview and our mission statement?
Right.
Maybe
So, Charles, at our last meeting, I thought we had agreed, and I don't mind the conversation we've been having, but I thought we had agreed that this meeting was going to be dedicated to us pulling together a proposal of how we, either as individuals of the committee or as the committee, can best support the Board of Trustees. And maybe it
Exactly.
is looking at individual projects. So I'm going to say again, maybe the next meeting, let's just dedicate our time to that. So we've gotten a couple of good ideas out of this, like, we'll see what kind of formats Augie can give us on reports. And we could do some of the analysis to provide to the board. But this could be a proposal as well. For major projects, we think we as a committee can help you by looking at A, B, C, D, E, whatever that list is.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So to recap thus far, and I had two more items that I thought we might consider, but the call it however many, there's the reporting, that structure being looked at, and then being able with that to conduct, ongoing monthly revenue and expense analysis and provide feedback accordingly. There was the capital budget, particularly in the context of a 5-year longer term capital planning structure to participate in. And then related to that is understanding better the bonding and amortization process as to how it relates to the capital budget and engaging with potential recommendations in that context. Possibly procurement, if we can continue that conversation, whether we want to be a resource to, for lack of a better word, police and scrutinize the procurement process, maybe as we talked about very early on as a group, because it's such a heavy lift to be able to spot check, invoices and things like that, and proposals that are coming across the table, that's something we could talk about. My other two were, one, having members of the committee be dedicated to revisiting the schedule for the upcoming year, both for the committee, but also the board and Jerry's team, and looking back at the prior year. I think a lot of things worked really well, and then as we came down to the deadlines, there were obviously challenges again. So to have a member or two of this committee focus on structuring that, and that would also give our committee guidance as to how we operate within our own schedule. And my only other one was, we talked about when we've obviously put together a capital budget framework with recommendations, and we moved into creating an operating budget set of recommendations that were more focused on the current budget, and we had talked about wanting to expand that into a broader working document for the operating budget, similarly to what we did for the capital budget.
Well, the first draft of what we did on the operating budget was the more general. And then time kept ticking on and we just focused on the current year.
Yeah.
So I think we can
Yep.
go back to the first draft and dust that off and see where that stands.
That'd be great. Any other ideas for areas of focus and priority for the upcoming year, and then we can look at this in the minutes, and then reconvene next time and talk about possible next steps with Dan in terms of presenting, and then formations of subcommittees.
I would say if you have your list written down, Charles, if you could send that to Bill.
Thank you, Ellen.
Yep.
That's a great suggestion. I've been busily trying to make notes of as Charles read them off, but I can use that assist
Yeah, I think we all could. So,
for my maiden voyage.
That was a good list, Charles.
yeah, that was a good
Cool.
list.
All right, great. Yeah, I'll summarize that. If anybody else thinks of anything else that they want to add, we'll just communicate.
Yeah,
it, and then we can go from there.
Just one point when we're talking about the capital budget is still have to deal with funding source. Where are we going to get the money to pay for capital projects and how it affects the following year's operating budget. Because once you bond,
Yep, and that's,
you have to, yes.
yep. And Glenn, like another thing that just came to mind was, they do add up, perhaps there being a focus on the grants as well.
Yes. Yeah, there's different grants that we supposedly get annually, and that's something else that I thought when a capital project was done, that there should be a check-off list. It should be a capital project is proposed, the capital project is approved by the trustees, the capital project is actually done, and attached to that is what the proposed funding source is and how it's actually funded.
Well,
And
I
that's
think you
how-
missed the
that-
first step, which I'm gonna call the business case for the capital project. Who's
Yeah.
ever requesting this project needs to put forth to the board something documenting the need. And a
Yeah, well,
risk assessment of the opposite. If we don't do it, this is what it
Yeah.
needs. Yep.
But
That's
that
step
would-
one.
that would simply be putting it on the list, and then what you just said has to be, as you take the project off the capital list and the trustees look at it, what you said is absolutely has to be done before the trustees approve a capital project.
Yep. I know, my last job, we had, similar to what you just said, a whole checklist of what needed to be done when a new financial product was being proposed and potentially implemented. It was step through, do we need more step, what's the product, what's the risk? What are the federal regulations around it? Do we need more staff to support it? Do we need blah, 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 blah. What does it take to implement, all of that before it ever went to the executive committee? All of that needed to be laid out. So we had a whole checklist. So I think that's a great idea.
Great. Did anyone have anything else?
No.
You'd like a motion to adjourn?
Are you home yet, Charles?
Yes, I am.
Yay.
Do we have a second on the motion to adjourn?
I'll second.
All those in
In
favor?
favor, aye.
I,
Aye.
Okay,
Sounds great.
Hey,
Yes.
thank you all.
yeah,
Thanks, everyone.
Charles, I'll
Thank you.
look
Good
for that. I'll look for that list from you, Charles, to incorporate as best I